So welcome, Professor, to our interview project for the Philosophy Society. So just to start off the interview here today, could you please introduce yourself in 2 minutes, like who you are and what is your major in and all of that?
I'm Peter Slezak. I'm a philosopher. I work now in the School of Philosophy at the University of New South Wales. My main areas of interest are broadly the philosophy of science, but more specifically the interdisciplinary field of cognitive science, the philosophy of mind, psychology, and the philosophy of language, really.
That's perfect. So is there a particular author whose work has deepened your knowledge about yourself and your place in the world?
Well, that's a funny question to ask because academic philosophy is not really about oneself and one's place in the world, although I could answer that in a certain way. But of course, it's an academic discipline that deals with a range of problems that are not so much about oneself, but about the mind. The philosophy of science deals with different disciplines and how to understand explanations, and ethics deals with moral questions. So I wouldn't answer the question quite as directly in the way you asked it. Of course, one always has reflections on oneself and one's place in the world, but that's a kind of a traditional common sense view of what philosophy is, but it's not exactly what most academic philosophers would describe as their concern.
All right. So what would so in your understanding, what would you describe it as the philosophy that you like, or who's your so what school of philosophy do you like the most, and who's your most favorite philosopher?
My area is broadly characterized as analytic philosophy. That's a loose but reasonable characterization of a certain way of doing philosophy, and it's distinguished from what's referred to as continental philosophy. So there are certain authors that typically you'd be interested in and you would read as an analytic philosopher, concerned with philosophy of science, with logic, with a certain kind of approach to philosophy that cares about precision, clarity, and there are various stereotypes and prejudices that both sides have about each other. So I'm not a continental philosopher, and I don't read people, broadly speaking, in that large area. Analytic philosophy has a history which anybody trained in the field is more or less familiar with, starting perhaps with Wittgenstein and Bertrand Russell and Gottlob Frege, who is a very important figure in the foundations of mathematics and logic. So these are the great figures in the foundations of analytic philosophy, and there's a whole number of more modern philosophers. In my own personal history as a student, I was very interested in reading Bertrand Russell, his popular writings, and only later I came to his more technical philosophical work. So he's been a very important figure in my own personal development, but so have many others.
So how has Bertrand Russell changed the way you view the world and how you perceived yourself as well?
Yeah, look, I think in a way, especially in my early years, Russell's writings were very formative in the sense that he presented a view of the world both in ethics and in political views, and his concern with clarity and his history of Western philosophy is a very interesting and inspiring work. But his popular writings about religion, for example, were very influential when I was about 16 or 17. He basically espoused an atheist view. He was dismissive of the dogmas of religion and their harmful effects on education and on people's well-being and their moral life. I found that as a 16-year-old very refreshing, and one of the most striking things about Russell was that he said things that were so obvious about sex, about morality, about religion and science, things that were so obvious but nobody else seemed to believe them. He seemed to be a lone voice of common sense and decency, and that was very inspiring, but it was also the first glimpse of a dissident figure who is an outsider really to the most widely held views on many subjects in politics, in ethics, in education. So that was a very useful beginning, but also the path towards a kind of a dissident alternative and a rigorous attempt to understand the world.
See. So what makes you get out of bed in the morning?
That's a tough question. Look, there are many things. I mean, not everything that gets me out of bed in the morning is to do with professional philosophy. There are a lot of other reasons to get out of bed in the morning, depending on one's good fortune and whether one's life is, rewarding and satisfying, family, and other extracurricular activities, playing sport and enjoying music. But in my academic life, which is very central to my work and my life, reading the philosophers that I think are interesting and pose questions that I think are interesting to think about and perhaps to even think of solving. So in philosophy, I have certain particular interests that I spend a lot of time on. And I have to say, my own particular experience, politics has played a considerable role in my life increasingly, partly through the influence of people like Bertrand Russell. And it's not an accident that as a kid I started with Bertrand Russell and ended up with Noam Chomsky, because interestingly, Chomsky has on his wall in his office a big picture of Bertrand Russell. So I was headed in that direction long before I realized that that would lead me to Chomsky's work, who's been extremely influential in my own career, both in his political writings, but also especially in his academic technical work in linguistics and in philosophy.
So how has politics influenced your philosophical thinking?
It hasn't. I don't think my interest in politics has any direct connection with my philosophical work at all, really. The areas of interest in philosophy to do with language or consciousness or psychology, they're problems that have an internal structure and internal puzzles that they pose. Politics is quite separate. It's to do with one's existence as a human being in the world and the problems that we face. And from Chomsky, I certainly learned, as from Bertrand Russell, the importance of being engaged in these political problems, but they're quite separate from the academic and intellectual questions that come up in one's philosophy, which are often quite abstract. Philosophy of mathematics, for example, doesn't bear very directly on the world at all.
Okay, I see. But is there anything from your understanding or from your knowledge about philosophy that inform you to look at politics in a certain way, or there's nothing at all?
Well, only in a very general sense that, if one values rigor and scholarship and attempts to understand the world, one has to make an effort to read widely and read alternative points of view. So there's a general outlook that I guess, if you take it seriously in philosophy, that has some kind of consequences for how you approach political life. For example, John Stuart Mill encourages one to take seriously views one doesn't agree with, to hear the devil's advocate. That's an important intellectual and moral and perhaps political point of view. So there are these indirect questions, but they have more to do with a seriousness about understanding the world and trying to have an honest approach to the truth about things, even though the truth may be uncomfortable and may not correspond with one's own prejudices or one's own community, one's own allegiances, ethnically, religiously, culturally. That's the challenge always in politics, that we tend to grow up in a certain environment and absorb the dogmas that are shared in the community, and for most people that's more or less difficult to extricate themselves from. So philosophy certainly encourages a kind of clear thinking and even objectivity, and which has to do with the method that one approaches any subject, as in philosophy. You read the alternative views and you take them seriously.
I see. So where do you get motivation when you face challenges in your life?
These are very difficult questions. Challenges in one's life. There are very many different kinds of challenges. So it's a bit hard to answer that question without being more specific. Look, in philosophy, there are challenges because there are problems that people argue about, and the controversies are unsolved or unresolved. And so they pose a challenge because one would like to figure them out. So most of my philosophy work is grappling with what are the hot topics, the controversies that remain unresolved, and trying to find a solution or trying to find what is the preferred view among the contested views. So that's that part of the world that is very motivating. That's my professional work. But it's also, I mean, look, for many academics, if they're lucky, the borderline between their professional and personal interests is not a clear one. I mean, I've been very fortunate in having an academic job which happens to pay me for my personal interests. I think many academics would say that that's the great privilege and good fortune of an academic job, that you are being paid for pursuing questions that you think are important and interesting, independently of the fact that you're employed to engage in those things and teach them.
I see. So what inspired you to pursue a career in academia, and what do you find most fulfilling about your work in academia?
Well, what inspired me was perhaps my earliest experiences at the university were not in philosophy. I started a science degree, and to this day my main inspiration, I suppose you'd say, or intellectual motivations have to do with understanding the world in a scientific sense. And I started a science degree and studied science for several years before I turned to, as it was, sociology, and then to philosophy in an academic sense. And then the opportunities for an academic life became available or possible, and that was very inspiring, just because of the great virtues of having the opportunity to study questions I think are important and interesting, and not least of all to teach. I found teaching a very rewarding and very satisfying and meaningful thing to be doing, and apart from that, it's a lot of fun. Teaching in the classroom is challenging, and I found it always extremely enjoyable, partly because I taught in a certain way, I guess. Many colleagues don't show their own views and feign a kind of neutrality, but I've always presented my views very forthrightly to students, not in order to bludgeon them into agreement, but on the contrary, to provoke them to disagree. And that's been a good formula, and students generally respond well to that, and that's very stimulating. And so teaching is very rewarding, partly also because you think you're doing something that is worth doing and is useful, teaching students certain particular ideas, but also teaching them to think clearly and to reason. And that has political consequences in the ways that I was describing.
I see. So how has engaging with philosophical texts or debates enriched your personal and intellectual life?
How has being engaged in the text enriched my life?
Yeah, your personal and intellectual life.
Well, it consumes my personal and intellectual life. I tend not to read much fiction, really. So my personal interests in reading are almost entirely non-fiction philosophy and science and politics, increasingly. So, of course, it's very enriching, because that's where I gain my sustenance and enrichment entirely from an intellectual point of view. The problem is there's too much to read. I can't get through all of the books in my library. And so it's a never-ending source of interest and stimulation, and the ambition to understand more of the things that one doesn't yet understand, both in science especially and in philosophy as well.
I see. So I see, like, in your personal website, you've done a lot of articles about faith and reason and all of that. So are faith and reason mutually exclusive, and between science and spirituality, are they compatible?
Are faith and reason mutually exclusive? I think so. I mean, the terms are a bit loose, but broadly speaking, again, the inspiration from people like Bertrand Russell is that one has to separate one's thinking from faith, if that means belief without reason, without grounds. If that's what a faith is, it's not a good way to conduct one's intellectual life. One should seek reasons, and good reasons, and the evidence for any belief. Most people find that more or less difficult to do, but that's a responsibility we have. And so, yes, I think faith and reason are really polar opposites. Spirituality has no place in my life, only because maybe I was fortunate not to be brought up in a dogmatic ideological or religious environment. So I was kind of left alone. And early on, again reading Bertrand Russell, came to see the good sense in his essentially atheist views and his idea that science is the guide. I remember reading, perhaps the first book I read of Russell's was his little book called Religion and Science. And he said something to the effect, I still remember it near the end of the book, I think he says, if science can't explain something, then mankind will never know it. Now, there's a lot to be said about how science works, and it's not dogmatic, and it has certain very interesting, important features, but it's the most reliable way we have to understand the world. And that's often contrary to things that people believe on faith. Faith usually means blind faith, and that means much of the traditional religions. So yes, I've taught courses and written quite a bit in debating with religious figures. I'm rather proud of the fact that I'm invited often by religious groups to debate with their leading thinkers, Christian, Muslim, and others, and I enjoy that. I think it's a worthwhile and interesting and important thing to be doing. But my view is always that science has to be our guide to what we believe, and the traditional religions have another approach, which I think is unfounded. The dogmas of Christianity, of Judaism, or of Islam are not supported by science, and so then one should guide one's beliefs by the evidence and the methods of science, for all their advantages and all their flaws.
So how does science inform people about the question of values, right? So because like usually we have religion, like in my understanding is like religion provide a set of values to people, and then based on those values they can organize their life around that. But then like if we, like according to what you're saying, then if we remove religion, then the question of values there is how can we deal with that question then, right?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, going back to David Hume, he made the important is-ought distinction. Clearly, science doesn't tell you what you ought to do, it tells you what is. And so the question of values doesn't come from scientific knowledge. The science just tells you the way that things appear to be in the world. And the values have to come from somewhere else. And of course, that's what moral philosophy is all about. Where do you find the values to guide you in life? We're talking about ethical values. That's a big subject. That's the subject of moral philosophy. A lot of answers to that question. I've broadly been inspired, I suppose, by a broadly utilitarian point of view, which some great philosophers have advocated. So, but yes, the question of one's values in life that's a question that has to be formulated in some ways, inspired often by religious views, because they often have certain views that are admirable from a moral point of view, but science doesn't provide that.
I see. So in what ways do you think philosophy can help us navigate in the complexities and uncertainties of the modern world?
Well, it's not only in the modern world, I guess it's been around for a while, and in the ancient world it was also a guide, and reading Plato and other philosophers gives you an idea of how these questions arose a long time ago. Plato's dialogues are very interesting from that point of view, as are many other texts, Aristotle, in the Western tradition anyway. As I say, I don't think that philosophy, certainly not the technical philosophy I'm interested in, provides a guide for how to live one's life as such, except in an intellectual sense. I think that's important. It's a model for clear thinking and for rationality and for reasoning about things in general. That's a guide of a certain kind, which I think is important. The great philosophers I admire care a lot about thinking clearly. That's the analytic tradition, I guess. And that's true in the way in which it inspires political reasoning as well. So it's not a guide to life in the ways in which some philosophers write about their concerns, at least in my case, because it's really continuous with science and understanding the Big Bang and quantum physics, if I could, and various other aspects of science, or the mind and consciousness, or language. These things don't inspire or inform the way you live your life exactly.
So So as you know, like AI is increasingly capable of doing many things, like from physical work to the mental tasks. And then once like again humans' place in the world is being questioned by this new technology. So in your understanding, how can philosophy help us in these new circumstances that we found ourselves in?
Today?
Yeah, like today, given the rise of AI and all of that. So how can philosophy uh, can help us to navigate the to navigate to navigate through this new technological transformation?
I don't think it does, really. I mean, except clear thinking and being well informed. So you're asking about how philosophy helps us guide us in life in the modern world. I don't think it does, at least not the kind of academic and technical philosophy that I'm interested in. It's not a formula for how to live your life, except in a very general sense that you should care about the truth and you should care about reasoning properly. Those are certainly important values, but the answers to the questions about society and where it's going, one has to be well informed about society, and there are certain values that, human values that one should share, I think, that are not hard to discern. As for artificial intelligence and so on, these are technical questions that are now at the forefront, but perhaps every technology posed certain difficult questions, and I don't think philosophy has anything special to offer.
Okay, I see. So, do we have free will, or like, are we just products of deterministic forces that shape who we are? So, as a philosophy professor, what is your understanding of the question, and what's your answer to that?
We need a whole semester to answer that question. That's the question of free will and determinism. I mean, I've taken courses and taught courses about that question. There's old literature, obviously, on the free will question. I can give you a kind of a simple summary of what my view is about that. I think, apart from quantum physics and some subtleties like that, we can conveniently assume that determinism holds, certainly at the macro level. I mean, our bodies and ordinary size objects are governed by the laws of nature. So determinism is the idea that everything is predictable from the laws of nature, if only you had enough of the initial conditions, if you had the facts. So the problem is posed, what about free will? What about my actions when I raise my arm or take any decision? Is that just like billiard balls bouncing around according to the laws of physics? Well, I think the answer is yes. And then the question is, what about choice, and particularly what about moral responsibility? I mean, without giving an hour-long lecture, the position that I hold, like many other philosophers, is called compatibilism. Let me give you Bertrand Russell's formula for this. Determinism is true, so how do we understand our choices and our free will? Russell says, of course we make choices, it's just that our choices are determined, which is a sort of a joke, but it's a way of saying that you have to understand free will and choice within a deterministic framework. And I think it's not hard to understand that, because in the end, choices are decisions we make based on our values, our priorities. We make a kind of calculation. A chess program that is designed with a certain algorithm, it can't find the right answer, let's say, in a particular move by brute force, because the game is too large. So it uses various heuristics in searching, but it makes a decision in a real sense in the way we do. It has to reason, it has to think through the alternatives, the options, and weigh them. Well, that's what a decision is. Now, that's not incompatible with determinism. In fact, it requires determinism. So the compatibilist view is that free will that we care about, the choices that we make, are a reflection of our values and our beliefs. But that's consistent with a deterministic picture.
I see. It's quite an interesting response to that. So, what is your understanding of human nature based on your experience and your expertise?
What's my understanding of human nature? Well, look, I mean, the obvious thing to say is we're biological objects, we're evolved, we're designed by the processes of natural selection and evolution. So the question of human nature really comes down to the scientific question of the kind of organism we are, the kind of minds that we have. These are very deep and interesting questions, but they're questions of psychology and biology, and For example, my area of interest in language is one part of that. Chomsky is very important in this area because he sees language as a species-specific feature of human beings. So it's a unique property that human beings have innately, determined by our genetic makeup, the structure of our brains. And understanding that gives us an insight into human nature and certain ways in which we are as organisms. For Chomsky, there is some tenuous but real political consequences of that. Given the nature that human beings have, the need for freedom and independence, that has some consequences for the kind of society we might design. But the questions of human nature are essentially scientific questions about biology, really, and psychology. And so that's why those subjects are extremely interesting, because they're telling us about ourselves and what's unique about human beings compared with other animals. And language is one important example of that. Despite the common idea that we communicate perhaps in the ways that other animals do, it seems pretty clear that human language is unique in its technical features, its structure, its mathematical properties.
So what kind of like gave rise to the uniqueness of the language, like of the human's language?
What's the question?
So what kind of like, what make human language to be unique?
Human language, from Chomsky's work, Chomsky's work is not shared by every linguist in the world, it's controversial, but his very significant contribution has been to show that what he calls the creativity of human language is a technical computational property. Descartes already understood this, as Chomsky always points out. He believed at the time that language was the one significant piece of evidence that we're not machines, but machines in the 17th century meant clockwork. And he realized that clockwork is completely deterministic, and therefore it doesn't explain how we're capable of an apparently infinite novelty. We can say things that in a sense we're not programmed for, that the clockwork can't account for. Descartes couldn't have anticipated Alan Turing's discovery of the kind of computational properties that may be embodied in us. And that's Chomsky's claim, that we have a certain recursive ability. He uses von Humboldt's idea of infinite capacity from finite means. The brain is only finite, but because of its computational properties, it is capable of infinite novelty. So we hear things we never heard before. We can say things which have never been said before. So this infinite creativity comes from a certain recursive computational ability that we have in the way our brains are designed. And that was probably some mutation, Chomsky thinks, that we had a couple of 100,000 years ago that made humans separate from their antecedents.
Interesting. So out of like many different fields in philosophy, why did you choose like language or linguistic as a field to study or research?
Well, my interest began with philosophy of science. In fact, the philosophy of social sciences. It's turned out some of those areas of interest have come back in the philosophy of language in a surprising way. Most philosophers, by the way, have a view of language which quite diametrically opposed to Chomsky's. The orthodoxy in the philosophy of language and proper names, Kripke and Davidson and various mainstream philosophers, the dominant view is quite contrary to Chomsky's view. There's a very lively debate that I'm very interested in about the nature of language. But because I started off with the scientific interests, inevitably studying the mind and becoming interested in neuroscience, inevitably one ends up taking an interest in Chomsky and these debates. And I happen to be sympathetic to Chomsky's view against the mainstream philosophers in my profession.
See. So what advice would you give to your younger self or to the people who just start out in your field?
That's a very tough question. My younger self at the university, I was absolutely fascinated by science and I was passionate about science, but I was very undisciplined. So instead of doing my homework, I at the time, there was a big computer. It was one of the first computers. It wasn't a laptop that you could have on your desk. There was the university computer, a great big solid state machine. And I found I had access to it. And so I spent all my time learning how to program it, and I didn't study enough, so I failed some of my subjects, and cut a long story short, I got kicked out of the university. So I'm not sure what advice to give my younger self. If I had studied harder and passed my subjects, and I may have just ended up doing boring work in some chemistry laboratory. So I don't think I should advise young people to not do their homework and not take their studies seriously. But for me, it was kind of fortunate because it led me to philosophy, and the science background was very useful, but I wasn't a very disciplined student. I was too young and had too many diverse interests, so I was a dilettante. So it's a bit hard to give advice to one's earlier self. I'm sure I made lots of mistakes, but one couldn't have planned the path that I ended up in through these accidents of one's life. So it's a bit hard to give a good answer to that question.
So you mentioned like you have a diverse interest, right? Like your personal interest, like. So I also happen to be that person. Like I have a variety of interests in different fields and all of that. So given the constraint of the world, like the time that we have, and the thing that we have to do, so what is your advice to those kind of people who happen to have like a diverse interest in everything, like in not everything, like a variety of things?
There's no way to answer that question, you see. I think the only advice is to follow one's interests. You have to make choices, obviously, for a career, and you have to pass your exams, which maybe I didn't do as well as I should have. But these accidents determine how one's life unfolds, and it's very hard. I think one piece of advice I do give students when they come to the desk on open day before they enroll at the university, they often want to do something that their parents think is very important for a career, and I give them rather subversive advice, and I say, just do what you're interested in. I mean, if you're going to look forward to a career, there's nothing worse than ending up doing some terrible job that you did because it was useful and practical and boring. So I think, depending on one's circumstances, clearly you have to make a living and there are practical questions. But on the other hand, there's a lot to be said, especially if you have the opportunity to study stuff that you're really interested in, because that's what motivates you. That's where your passion is, and that's where it's easy. You don't have to be forced to do homework in a subject that you're interested in. And everybody knows that, every student knows that. So that's sort of easy to answer. You have a passion for, now of course you have to discover the things you're interested in. That's another reason to study, certainly earlier in your university career, a wide range of subjects. One of the great advantages of the American system is that professional degrees tend to be postgraduate, and you study a liberal arts degree before you do medicine or law. I think that's super, because that means you start to discover things you didn't know about philosophy or psychology or history or whatever, anthropology. You would have thought of taking certain subjects until you were required to do that. So I think, in general, read widely, take courses in subjects you never thought of taking. Even in graduate school in America, unlike in Australia, there was a very large coursework component where you had to do a certain number of subjects. I would have never taken a course in ethics and moral philosophy. I didn't think I was interested, but it was important and interesting, political philosophy. And so there were required subjects when I was in graduate school in America, and that's very valuable because you become well-rounded. You learn about a lot of things that you wouldn't have thought you found interesting. So reading widely and taking courses widely and discovering what you're interested in, you may suddenly find you have an interest in something you hadn't even thought about.
So you keep mentioning reading widely and reading in a variety of themes and topics and all of that. So what are some recommended books that you would like to suggest to other people?
You ask very hard questions. What recommended books? I have shelves of books that I haven't read yet, so I recommend all of them. Well, I mean, where do you start?
Look, so let's just like philosophical books. Like, what are some of the recommended philosophical books that you would like to recommend?
Goodness me, you'd think I'd be able to answer that question a bit more easily. But, I mean, funny enough, I think it's good to read some good popular expositions. There's a prejudice among academics that you should read the primary sources. If you pick up Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, you'll never touch philosophy again. It's absolutely unreadable. obscure, and I don't think that's good advice to young students. I'm a great fan of, I spend a lot of my time reading and writing and thinking about René Descartes, but even philosophers like Descartes take a kind of you have to sort of work your way into them and understand them. Reading good expositions is a good way to get a feeling for what's interesting about philosophers, what's controversial about them. There are wonderful philosophers. Descartes' wonderful. Read a good book about Descartes, or Kant for that matter, or Spinoza, who I only read more recently in my career. Spinoza was an extremely interesting character, partly through his life experiences. And Bertrand Russell, of course. Although, I mean, he wrote quite a long time ago, his books are still available, and they're inspiring. So they're the sorts of books that inspired me when I was starting philosophy, and I don't think they're entirely a bad recommendation. I mean, look, the classic sources of analytic philosophy, you know, David Hume is wonderful to read. But the other thing is, I discovered very late in my career, there's a number of philosophers who have been neglected in the analytic tradition, in the curriculum and in scholarship. I've only discovered relatively recently people like Thomas Reid, who is amazingly, wonderfully interesting, controversial, very critical of David Hume. The curriculum tends, in the Western universities, tends not to include Thomas Reid. Equally, everybody reads Descartes, but nobody reads Antoine Arnaud and Nicolas Malebranche. They had the most amazing debate, a very controversial encounter and controversy, and they're wonderful to read about. And one of the leading writers about those philosophers is a philosopher in University of Wisconsin in Madison, Stephen Nadler, and he's written the most wonderful popular books about Spinoza and his excommunication from the Jewish community where he lived in. So reading these, I think, biographies of philosophers is, I think, a very good way to get into philosophy. For example, if I'm thinking about it, the biographies of Wittgenstein by Ray Monk, I think it is. They're wonderful to read about, one of the most important founders, really, of the analytic tradition in recent times. An interesting, controversial and troubled character. So I think reading biographies is a good way to get into philosophy by the good writers. And there are many biographies. There's a recent book, I can't remember what it's called now, about the development of logical positivism, Moritz Schlick and the founding fathers of the positivist movement in the 1930s and afterwards. So I think it's a good idea to read about philosophers as a way of getting into their ideas and finding out what's interesting about them.
I see. So is there meaning to life and at all? So
what a funny question. Is there any meaning to life? Students ask this question. I taught courses where that question was posed and we read articles about it. But it's a very funny question because, I mean, it's usually based on some kind of misconception or preconceptions, especially for people who have religious views, where they think that the meaning of life must come from the meaning that is given to them by some deity. And for many students, if God doesn't exist, they think their life isn't meaningful, which is a kind of crazy idea, as if your life has to depend on somebody else. And of course, for everybody, it's an individual question. The meaning of your life is your family, I don't know, the things you like doing. Look, ultimately, if you really want to know, I'm an atheist, and for an atheist, there is no ultimate meaning at all. I mean, it's a bleak sort of, Woody Allen view, what's the point of all this? Well, there isn't one. That's a kind of funny answer to give. I mean, it's a silly answer in one sense because, I like reading certain things, I like reading philosophy, that's the meaning of life. The meaning of life must come from within one's life. By the way, Bertrand Russell has a very inspiring couple of essays about this. I think one of them is called What I Believe, and the other one is called Why I'm Not a Christian. And he explains how, if you're an atheist, what is the meaning of life? They're very inspiring, again, for somebody who has a scientific viewpoint, not a religious viewpoint. Now, it's not that life has no meaning, it's that the meaning doesn't come from the traditional conceptions of an afterlife, for example. That makes a difference to how you live your life. If you don't think there's an afterlife, in a way it makes life more meaningful because you better make the best of it. So it's hard to give a single answer to that question because it's going to be different for everybody, depending on what your interests are. For somebody who I've been watching stupid stuff online, people jumping off buildings or, doing these insane kind of dangerous things. Well, for some people that's the meaning of life. I wouldn't do it, but if that is exciting and interesting. Some people like collecting stamps. Well, everybody has to find their own, and there's no one answer to that.
So, what is your meaning of life?
Well, look, the first thing that comes to mind is my family, kids, grandchildren. That's a very important part of what gives life to anybody, and mine in particular. Friendships and my academic, intellectual life. Those are important parts. I play tennis badly. That seems meaningful while I'm on the tennis court, getting annoyed about a bad shot. So, there's no overarching answer. You discover that life is a sequence of events and interests, and they collectively make up the meaningful life every day. It's important to find those things that you find interesting. So in the end, it's a matter of being engaged and thinking about problems that are interesting. Not everybody finds that. Maybe some people just, I like listening to music where you just listen. Music is a big part of my interest and makes life meaningful. I try to play some instruments badly, but I think finding interests and finding things that engage your mind. Now, maybe not everybody thinks that. Maybe just sitting on the beach and soaking up the sun or doing something. Everybody has a different answer to that question.
So with that, we're gonna wrap up here today. Thank you, Professor Peter, for coming here today with us. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the questions.